Hello guys, hi. Since long I have not been discussing anything, so I thought of maybe bringing this group live again and sharing with you guys something very important again about the basics of designing a SIP trunk, or how, for example, a customer currently has, an ISDN or T1E1 connection for Cisco IP telephony, and he wants to migrate to a new SIP technology. So how can he plan? How can you help him to plan to migrate from the old ISDN technology to the SIPTrunk technology? So there are some very basic questions that you need to ask before even you start configuring something on the customer devices. So the first thing that you need to ask customer, or there are a couple of questions that you need to ask your customer is, let me show you a notepad that I have been, I had a lot of issues while designing a SIP trunk for a customer, and because it was new for me a couple of years back, and since then I have been preparing that questions and asking these questions to the customer, and this is how it became easy for me to implement the new SIP trunk or migrate the customer environment from um, ISDN technology to the SIP trunk technology. The very first question, so let's take a look at all these questions. The first question that you should ask to the customer is, you know, how will be this cube placed in the customer environment? So is there any firewall before or behind? I mean, so is there any firewall before the cube, or is the cube in the DMZ? Because some customers want still a secure connection for the VoIP technology. That's why they sometimes have a cube and then a firewall, and then it goes to the provider. And then what kind of router does a customer have? Because we need to check. I will be showing you further the supported routers for the SIP connection, for the Cisco routers, I mean. So what model of router does a customer have? Can you just send us the running configuration so that I can have a look at your current configurations and maybe figure out something which is important, like for example, you have an SRST configuration, in case there is a loss of connection to the communications manager, what happens then? The devices are registered locally on the router. So show version, so what is the iOS versions, and what are the other informations? I can have a look at those informations if the customer can send us the show version. Show diag, show inventory, the hardware information. What kind of hardwares does a customer have? For example, does the customer have a DSP module running? Maybe it's for hardware conference bridge the customer has, and this conference bridge is registered to this router, so we need to have this information beforehand. And is there a smart licensing account? Because starting with some latest versions of the iOS, the cube has to register to the smart licensing. Otherwise, the SIP to SIP calls will be blocked in case after certain period of time. So that's why you need to have a smart licensing account nowadays. We need an administrator account, so the person. So we need an admin account to have access to the router, so that we can configure the SIP configuration on the router. Then how many parallel SIP trunk sessions are needed? Maybe the customer has, for example, an E1 or a T1 card currently, but he needs to increase the number of channels. But it's really difficult currently, because then he needs to purchase a new PRI card, and then he needs to install it and then do all the configurations again. But with the SIPTrunk sessions, it's just dependent upon the bandwidth that is available with the service provider. So it's really easy. So I'll tell you how do you calculate, how do you tell the customer, okay, if these are the concurrent number of calls, how do you do it? So for example, let me tell you right away. So let's say the customer says, I don't know, Amen, how many SIP-trunk sessions are needed. Can you help me understand that? So the easiest way that I could tell you guys is, um, you can go to one of the websites. It's easily available, I think. It's called as an erlang.com or something, I think, erlang.com. And yeah, you can go to Erlang B calculator. I just used it and I said, okay, I just need to put in some information. Like, for example, I said in the busiest hour of my calls, the duration will be 1 hour for the busiest hour of the calls, And so what is the percentage of calls that should be blocked, So let's say your line is completely full and the next call that comes in is busy. So what is the, depending on upon the impact on the business, the people might say, okay, it's okay for us if 99.9% of the time the calls are available and just 0.01% of the calls fail, So I just put these informations here and I say calculate, and it tells me, for example, what is the concurrent number of lines that you would need. So he says, I just need 5 concurrent lines or 5 concurrent sessions, And then depending upon this, you can also calculate, I think, the bandwidth that is required. So let's say, yeah, you can also do it manually for sure. I can do it, but just let me show it here because it's readily available. So you need to check with the provider for sure. What is the codec that the provider supports? This is the point. So codec G711, usually the provider says, okay, G711 U-law is okay for me, or A-law is okay for me, depending upon the regions, or G729. I haven't seen G729 yet, but because it's a compressed codec, so maybe there is an effect on the voice quality, that's why. But usually, sorry, it's either G711 U-law or A-law, and then I select OK, G711 uncompressed, and the packet duration is suggested by the provider, and it's always something like 20 milliseconds or 30 milliseconds of a voice packet. And now, because I know that I need 5 concurrent lines or 5 voice paths, I can calculate the bandwidth that is necessary. And then it says 400 kbps. So I can suggest to the customer, okay, so for you, let's say you need 5 concurrent calls, and then for this you will need a 400 kbps of voice bandwidth. This is just an assumption that I'm doing. So usually you will not order such a small bandwidth, So it's just an assumption that I'm saying. So using these calculators, you can usually calculate the bandwidth and design for a customer, what kind of bandwidth does a customer need and how many concurrent calls does a customer need. The next thing, the next important thing that you need to ask is, for example, in the SIPTrunk, as I told in my last session about SIP invite, so there needs to be a destination IP address that we will be sending an invite to, So we need to ask what is that IP address, because we need to configure that, on our cube, on our router. So this information needs to be sent by the customer. So the standard SIP port is 5060 for the communication. For signaling, ask the provider if he needs 5061 or some other port number. So sometimes the provider really says, okay, I don't need 5060 or 5061. I need maybe 5065, you know. So you just need to confirm with the customer and the provider about these informations. What kind of transport layer for the SIPTrunk do you support? For example, I have seen in Deutsche Telekom, they say that we don't support UDP, we only support TCP. You know, this is the provider in Germany, and they says, okay, we just support TCP, we do not support UDP because of some security reasons, maybe, you know. Codec, I already talked about codec, so they support G711. And what is the fax protocol? Are you still supporting G711 or for the fax, or many of the providers still do not support this latest fax protocol, which is T.38 for the SIP trunk, you know? So you need to really ask what kind of fax, because this fax has really given a lot of pain to many of the engineers I know, you know, because of this thing. Even Cisco TAC had a couple of problems sometimes, in my experience, to figure out the issues. But in the end, they solved it. But it was, you know, a lot of issues with this protocol, on the provider side, I mean, and not on the Cisco side. So what is the DTMF signaling mechanism? Does the provider support? Is he okay with these RFC, standard RFC 2833 for the DTMF, or, you know, they just want out of band, or something like this, you know? So you need to ask these questions. And then, do they need an early offer? So early offer usually means when you send the first invite to the provider, you also send the information about the media. You know, you send the session description, so what kind of codec, you know, what is the payload, and what is the endpoint IP address, and all those information you send it in the early offer. So is it needed so that, you know, the provider will then say, okay, I support this, and then they can negotiate the media, and then the media can connect. And then, what is the external IP address that is required for the service provider, you know, to authenticate the calls? So he says, is there anything special? So for example, I have a cube. On my cube, I have an external interface that will connect to the provider. And on this interface, is there a specific IP that the provider will provide, or is he okay to accept any internal IP addresses that the customer sends from his side? So usually, it's like the provider will say, okay, no, we will only accept the IP addresses from our side. They will provide an IP address, maybe slash 24 range. They will provide it to you, and then, yeah, you need to use their IP addresses on the external interface, you know. And then, is there any need for a registration for each DID? So usually, there are a couple of these informations that are very important. Does the service provider want to you know, register each of the DIDs? For example, 100 DIDs, you have 100 DID, or direct inward dial numbers. So do you want all these numbers to be registered on the service provider NGN, or NGN is next generation network? So, or is it okay if he just registers the main number with the SIPTrunk of the provider? And if yes, then what is the username and password? This username and password will be provided by the provider. You know, this is nothing to do with our side, but the provider has to provide this information so that we can configure it on our cube. And then, you know, the cube can register via the SIPTrunk to the service provider. And then, is there any need for a digest authentication, you know, to authenticate the calls if there are any outgoing calls? So is there any username and password needed for that, you know? um, is there a specific calling number that the provider says, okay, if this is the calling number from my DID, so let's say it says, I will accept all the calls with the calling number as 1000. So in the SIP invite, he should see the calling number, the from number, for example, as 1000. And then only he will accept the calls from our cube. So here's a cube, and um, then it is going to the ITSP via SIPTrunk. And then when someone makes a call, so let's say 2001 makes a calls to the service provider, the calling number should be 1000, and then the call will be successful. Otherwise the SIP provider will not accept the calls. It will reject the calls. Maybe he sends 4xx messages and say, okay, rejected, I cannot accept these calls. So let me show you one of the recommendation document for one of the providers in Germany. So basically, let's say this is the provider in Germany, that's Telekom Deutschland. And then he says, okay, these are my documents. And then he says for the SIP trunks, the prefix numbers are only provisioned in the next generation network, and the extensions of allocation is done in the SIP PBX itself, using the DDI feature. And then he has different registration mode. He has different connectivity modes. So maybe the SIP trunk is connecting to the NGN or to the SIP trunk service provider using a registration mode or a static mode. So basically, if there is a registration mode, then you will send a SIP register message. So in the SIP registration mode, you will be sending a SIP register message to the provider, and then the provider will check the information in the register message, like username and password and other informations. If those match, then the number will register and the SIP trunk will register, and then you will be able to make calls. And in this registration mode, there are different RFCs that a provider supports. So I'm just giving you a little bit of more information about the provider, one of the provider. Maybe you can ask the provider for the documentation for the, let's say, Vodafone or other providers, BT for example, and then they will be able to provide you such documents for the SIP trunk. So this provider supports RFC 6140, and then he says, okay, this kind of SIP PBX, they will publish the IP addresses to the NGN using a SIP registered message, according to RFC 6140. What if my PBX is not supporting 6140? Okay, he says, okay, that's not a problem. You can register via RFC 3261. Now, what is the difference between RFC 6140 and RFC 3261 between the registration methods? So basically, in the RFC 6140, maybe he needs some specific information, like he says, in the SIP message or in the SIP register message, I need this keyword to be entered, BNC should be entered. So how would you do this? So basically, yeah, he says, the contact header, the header of the register request must contain the IP address of the IPPBX in the host part and the BNC parameter. So he says, for example, this is the contact header. He says this is the IP address of the IPPBX with the port number, and then he needs this keyword BNC. If he doesn't see this keyword BNC, he will not register, And what happens this is for RFC 6140. This is how the SIP trunk will register. And what about in case my PBX is not supporting 6140, then I'll use 3261. And in 3261, how does the registration happens? The provider says the contact header of the register request, it must contain the prefix of the one of the phone number blocks configured for the SIP PBX in the user part, and the IP address of the SIP PBX in the host part. So basically he says he needs the prefix of the DID number that is being ordered by the SIPTrunk service provider, and the IP address of the host with the port number. You know, so this is how the register message should look like, and this is how the SIPTrunk registration will happen over the service provider. Okay, now these informations, once you clear with the service provider, with the customer, now you have all the needed informations that you need. You know, how many number of concurrent sessions, how many number of uh, um, so how should I register, and all these things. So it becomes a little bit easier now for you to start with the configuration or suggest the hardware now to the customer. So I was referring to one of the Cisco Live documents. So it's Cisco public, so that's why I'm sharing here. So basically, it says, okay, I need to now see. For example, I needed 5 concurrent calls. So for 5 concurrent calls, it's what is the kind of router that I need. So basically, if I have just a flow through, so um, sorry. So yeah, I need 4321 router, and it suppose 100 sessions with the iOS XE 16.6 or earlier, and and the next version iOS XE 16.12 plus. You see the concurrent sessions capacity has increased, so it has increased to 500. So just a moment, sorry. All right, so I'm sorry, I got a call from my wife. So, all right. So, yeah, I was talking about, the session capacity has increased to 500. So this is why um, you need to check which iOS version. So I'm okay with 4321 for now, router 4321, but you need to make sure in case you need a DSP, that DSP module is included. So you can go ahead and check the data sheet. For example, I can check the data sheet here. I've just took it from one of the websites, but you can also go to Cisco's website and get this document data sheet. That's easy, and see if you need a DSP module, because you have a hardware conference bridge. So you need to place it. So you need to, when there is an order going on, you need to ask the customer or your account manager or whoever is in the pre-sales that you tell them these things. Okay. The other important thing that you need to tell about hardware is how is the connectivity. Let's say I will show you. So let's say you have um, a router here, and then you have let's say a SIPTrunk service provider here. So this is your ITSP, and this is your cube, and then when you are connecting to the cube, so when this is connecting via the cube, you really need something, because the connection is going over the internet, over the DSL line, or some way to the IT service provider. So you need something like a modem or something, because you cannot directly connect to the cube gig interface, because there needs to be some protocol that understands uh, the SIP, or the internet connection, because you cannot directly connect to the cube's gig interface. So basically, it could be that there is no modem, or the service provider has not kept any modem, or provided any modem or router or something, and then you need a specific interface. So for example, with 4321 router, you would need something called as network interface module, which is something like the product name is NIM minus VA minus B. So this is a network interface module that you can insert it into the cube, and then you can connect, you know, the service provider link to this card, and then you can configure a dialer interface. So here you will configure a dialer interface, and in on the dialer interface you will configure an outbound SIPTrunk interface, you know. So this dialer interface can be configured as an external SIPTrunk interface to the service provider. All right. But also there is one thing. For example, I had a customer where a service provider came in. He provided the SIPTrunk line, a physical line, and on this physical line there was no copper connection. So it was, you know, there was no copper connection. It was just like something called as a telephony line, so legacy telephone line. So it was like, let me show you. Um, so it's a TAE connection. So it was something like this, you know. So yeah, something like this. So this you cannot directly plug into the router, right? So what you need to do is you need to then have again an adapter that can convert this TAE connector to the RJ45 or line, and then this RJ45 can be plugged into the dialer interface, you know. So this is how you connect the physical line. So make sure you ask the IT service provider that I need a copper connection, or what is the kind of connection that you provide. Maybe it's a fiber. If it's a fiber, then you need a GBIC card. So you can put it inside your Ethernet port, and then you have copper to fiber SFP module. So it's like an SFP module that you can put it inside your Ethernet interface, you know, for the cube to be connected. So these are the basic things. So once this is done, then you need to order the licenses. So basically you, depending upon the type of design that you need, I can talk about it later, but I don't want to make it a little bit more longer now. So maybe the customer says, okay, I need active connections, or I need an high availability, so that there are two cubes. So if one fails, I have a connection on the second cube, something like this. So depending upon the design consideration, maybe the customer says, I don't need SRST, you know, because I have a second call manager. So even if the first connection goes down, I'm still connected to my second call manager. So the devices are still registered. So I want to just save my cost, and I don't want to have a second cube, you know. So but what happens if the cube itself fails? You know, there are no calls. Maybe the cube crashes or something. So usually it will not happen, but in case it happens, you do not have a second router, you know, and you do not have a PSTN calls coming in or going out of your router. So this is why you need to make sure that you design carefully. You have a look at the guides. You have a look at this such good design documents provided by Cisco. It's free. You just need to create or register on this ciscolive.com portal, and you can get hold of these documents and understand, you know, what kind of call capacity, SIPTrunk sessions available per device, and TP, SRTP, then what kind of sessions are supported, and all such informations. So for example, it says, you know, SIP header manipulation. So in our case, for example, the case that I was talking about, so the provider wanted something like BNC in the SIP invite message, and I was, you know, manipulating the contact header for doing that. So in such cases, it says I need to create a SIP profile, right, in my Cisco cube. And if I create a SIP profile on my Cisco cube, then it says it has very less impact, maybe less than 5% on the number of sessions, you know. Um, Maybe it says if you manipulate the STP headers, in case you change the codecs, so uh, it will have impact of 6%. So depending upon this, you can definitely configure your cube in case you have any design questions, solution questions. How do I, design overall? You can contact me, and of course, I can definitely help you out because I have been doing a lot of migrations, and I will be doing a couple of more migrations this year. So it looks like I've been learning more, getting more information about the service providers, which is really important, and helping a lot of people around. So that's what I'm here for, to help the colleagues and get the help from other people. All right, so keep learning, keep collabing, guys, and if you have any questions, just comment it, ask me directly. It's not a problem. Have a nice day. Thank you. Bye-bye.